So in this session, we'll talk a little bit about Krishnaji's teaching and his connection with Buddha. Now, if we look at the whole lifespan of Krishnaji, the very first book which was published in his name was At the Feet of the Master. So that was published in 1910. And then immediately the following year, another book was published, which was titled as Education as Service. So Education as Service, that book explained the educational approach based on At the Feet of the Master. So if we consider whatever teaching is there in that book At the Feet of the Master, then what could be the education like according to At the Feet of the Master? And so that book was published with the title Education as Service. So after the publication of these two books, there was no other book published. But Krishnaji kept on writing articles as editorial notes in that journal called Herald of the Star. Then in 1922, he underwent that process. So we'll be talking about that process in some other session in little bit details. So after the process, the first book he wrote was published under the title The Path. So it's an interesting book, The Path. And after that, he continued to hold small group dialogues at Pergin, where he was discussing with the really serious-minded people, those who had dedicated their lives for the work of the world teacher. So to such a group, he was discussing. So many books came out of that discussion. The one major title which came out with those discussions was The Kingdom of Happiness. These groups were called as self-preparation groups. And then, so in those books, Krishnaji is talking about the passion and what is expected for those participants, what is expected from them, and how they can work on themselves. So those groups were called self-preparation groups, and then those discussions in very brief, our Krishnaji used to write articles for that self-preparation group also. So some of those articles are also available. So that was the period when, so the first period starting from At the Feet of the Master till the process. So Krishnamurti more or less appears like a disciple, trying to follow the instructions of his master. He is being instructed, he is being prepared, he is being told what to do, what not to do, and he is being groomed for his role as the world teacher. Then in 22, after the process, some changes happened inwardly, and there we see Krishnamurti thinking for himself, thinking by himself. So he's not just looking for the instructions and orders to be obeyed, but he has begun his own inquiry to understand things. He's observing people around him, he's trying to understand, and then out of his own inspiration, he's talking to those self-preparation groups. So this continues till 1929. And during this period, many more books came out. He also wrote some poems. So books containing his poems were also published during that period. So I think about 12 to 14 books they came out of in that period. And then in 1929, when he dissolved the Order of the Star and started his work as the world teacher. So from 1929 onwards, we see Krishnaji as the world teacher. And then he is talking on the basis of his own understanding. Then he is not quoting the masters, or he is not quoting the Theosophy. He is not quoting anybody. He is simply speaking on the basis of his own observations, on the basis of his own understanding. But still, there was a lot of influence of theosophical terminology on his expression. So therefore, many people, they consider that the expression during the period 1929 to 1933, that was not the real expression of the world teacher. It still showed the theosophical influence. But then from 1933 onwards, right, he had been able to put aside more or less all that influence, and then he was able to put in his own words whatever he was trying to convey. So many people think that the real teaching of Krishnaji, it starts from 1933 onwards. Then there is a lot of controversy about his first book, that was At the Feet of the Master. Many people believe that he did not write it because there is no handwritten manuscript available of that book. But the next book, which is Education as Service, there is a manuscript available of that book. So which clearly indicates that he wrote that. And since that book is based on At the Feet of the Master, right, it is quite likely that he had written that book also. But then the interesting thing is that if you read that book At the Feet of the Master, then in the introduction to that book itself, Krishnaji says that these are not my words. These are the words of the master who taught me. So that very first sentence itself does away with the authorship of Krishnamurti of that book. That means Krishnamurti himself is saying that he has not written it. Those are not his words. Those are the words of his master. So on that count, many people think that that book is not written by Krishnaji, and the content of that book is not the content of what Krishnaji talked later. But we'll come back to that later on when we will examine that little book in terms of the content with what Krishnaji talked later on, which we consider as his teaching. So from 1933 onwards, whatever he spoke, that is considered as the real teaching of the world teacher in his own expression. And from 1933 onwards also, a systematic record of what he spoke was maintained. A group of stenos used to listen to his talk, and they used to take down the whole talk in shorthand, and then immediately after the talk was over, they used to type the whole script, and then that used to be compared and then corrected, and then immediately the following year, the previous year's talks used to be published in the form of a book, and those books were called as the verbatim reports of his talks. So there are verbatim reports of his talks available right from 1933 to 1967, because this practice went on until 1967. In 1933 and around that period, there was no audio recording available for Krishnaji. And so this was the only way the record of his talks could be maintained. And he continued to hold camps and gatherings at Oman, Holland. So the last gathering was held there in 1938. So you can find the verbatim reports of his talks until 1938. Then 1939, the World War broke. So naturally, all those camps and that activity got suspended. In fact, the very place where the camps were held was turned into a concentration camp by the Germans. And so, therefore, later on, that place was not used by Krishnaji for any of his gatherings. So, during the Second World War period, Krishnaji lived at Ohio. He lived a quiet life because the American government banned him from giving any public discourses, because his anti-war views were well known, and the American government, being involved in the Second World War, did not want him to talk against war, because they needed support of their people in that war. So his public speaking was completely banned, and so he didn't give any talks or hold any dialogues. So he had a quiet time at Ohio, living the life of an ordinary person. And then it's only after the Second World War was over, that was in 1945, the ban was lifted and he was allowed to talk publicly. And so he gave a series of public talks at Ohio, California. And since those talks were immediately after the Second World War, so there were lots of questions he was asked about the war and why he is so much against wars and so on, and how, in what way wars can be avoided, what is the nature of wars and so on. So that went on. And then in 1947, when India became free, he visited India only in October onwards. And then he gave a series of talks. In fact, he stayed in India for a long time, and he gave so many talks in India. So in 1947, in 1948, and so on. And then he continued to visit India every year almost, and gave the public discourses. So mainly the places where he talked were Mumbai, then twice 2 years he talked in Pune also, and then Chennai and Delhi, and then Rajghat, Varanasi. So these were the places where mostly he gave his public discourses. In Kolkata, he gave only once he talked. That was in, I think, 1982 probably. He gave talks in Kolkata. They were his first and last talks in Kolkata. Then other places where he held dialogues or he visited or held discourses. One was Rajamundry in Andhra, and another place was Sangli in Maharashtra. And Pune, of course, he had given talks. Once in 1948, he gave a series of public discourses. And again, in 1957, he gave another series of discourses. So except for those two, he did not talk further at Pune. Then mostly his talks were confined to Mumbai. So Delhi, Mumbai and Chennai, and then Rishi Valley and Rajghat. So these were the 5 places where mostly he talked. There were few talks which he gave in Bangalore, and he also visited the Valley School, I think about a couple of times, and held dialogues there. But apart from that, He didn't talk much at Bangalore. So then that verbatim, the period of verbatim talks or verbatim reports of his talks. Now there his expression is more lucid. He is quite clear as to what he is talking about. But still he is fumbling with the words, in the sense that he is still trying to find out better and better words to convey exactly what he wanted to convey. So there you will find some words like, say, he always denies that you cannot experience the truth. So he doesn't accept the word experience. But there he also uses the word experiencing. So experiencing, he says, is a dynamic present state, while experience is already over, it is past, it is dead. So he is accepting the word experiencing, but he is rejecting the word experience. Similarly, the words which he used for change, so change, then radical change, then transformation, then radical transformation, then he's talking about inner revolution, then he's talking about psychological revolution. And after changing all these words, finally he settled on the word which he kept on using later on, was mutation. So we find that he kept on changing the expression. And I think that was necessary, because the moment he found that people were developing fixed ideas about what he is talking around that word, then he used to change that word. He used to stop using that word, and he used to introduce some another word for that, because he didn't want people to form fixed ideas around what he is talking about. But his expression became really precise and accurate when he started discussing with the scientists, particularly with David Bohm. When he started having dialogues, his expression became far more precise and far more accurate, because David Bohm's approach was quite different. Because if Krishnaji makes certain statement, then David Bohm used to ask him, okay, by this statement one can mean this or this or this. So this statement can be understood in these three different ways, or it can indicate these three different things. Now out of these three, which one you exactly mean? And then Krishnaji would point out of those three what he means, which one he means. And so like that, he helped Krishnaji to come out more precise, with more precise words. And so in a way, what we can say is that from 1980 onwards, the expression of Krishnaji is far more accurate, far more precise, and less likely to be misunderstood. So either you don't understand it or you understand it correctly. There is no possibility of misunderstanding, but he is trying to put in precise words what he has understood by that. So that's why many times it is recommended for a new person who is just beginning to read Krishnaji, that it's better he first studies his post 1980 works and then come back and read his earlier works. Then there is not much misunderstanding. So that is how his teaching evolved, not the content of the teaching, but the expression of the teaching. And I'm sure if Krishnaji were alive today, he would have still used different words. He would have changed all those words which now we are reading as he's teaching. Then when he spoke, each of his speech was a fresh investigation, a fresh inquiry. So it was never a repetition of what he had said before. So he may have talked on the same subject earlier many times. But then if he is talking about it in the present, he is not repeating what he had talked before. It is a fresh investigation. It's a freshly looking at the issue. And out of that looking, whatever he observed, he used to speak from that. And so many times you will find that he is coming out with some new perceptions, some new statements about the same issue, which he had not said before. So in that way, there is always a freshness to his teaching. And this was also evident because during those verbatim reports, after the stenos had typed the script, somebody had to go through it, correct it, edit it, and so on. So that work used to be done by a person called Madhavacharya. He was a retired civil engineer and he was associated with Krishnaji for a long time. And he used to do that editing work. Then somebody suggested, why not Krishnaji himself edit that? Then there is no possibility of any mistakes or any wrong statements there. So Krishnaji tried it. So I think he edited a few talks, and when those talks were read by the others, they said that, but you never spoke these things, what you have written in here. These are completely new things. And so it was discovered or found that Krishnaji was unable to edit his talks because while going through those reports or those talks, he was never happy with the expression. So he would correct all the expression. He will say, okay, this expression doesn't sound nice, so some another expression. So like that, he ended with changing the whole talk. And the person who read that report, he said, but you never said these things in your talk. So you have freshly written them. So it was found that Krishnaji was not a good editor of his talks. And so the practice of somebody else editing his talks continued. So after Madhavacharya, Sunanda Patwardhan, she used to edit his talks. And then they were published as the verbatim reports. Now coming back to the book At the Feet of the Master. Now if we simply put aside the traditional expression of that book, like the master and his teaching and whatever he has talked in terms of using traditional words. But if you just take the content of that book, then that content is not much different than the content which Krishnaji later on talked about. Because Krishnaji does talk about love, and At the Feet of the Master also talks about love. And Krishnaji does say that if there is love, then do what you will, you are always right. But if there is no love, you are always wrong. While in At the Feet of the Master, they say that, yes, if you have all the other qualities, but if you don't have love, then those other quality, all the other qualities, they come to nothing without love. But if you do not have any of those other qualities, but if you have only love, then that love is enough for you to acquire all the other qualities. So there again, the similar statement put in different words. Then there is also the other things like desirelessness. Now Krishnaji talked a lot about desire. What is desire? What is the nature of desire? What desire does, and so on. And in what way a person can be free of desire, and why there is a need to be free of desire. And almost in the similar tone, the book At the Feet of the Master also talks about desirelessness. So if you just put aside the expression, the format of the expression of that book, and just focus on the content, then that content is not much different than what Krishnaji talked about. But Krishnaji's approach was totally different. And with that approach, if we understand those contents, then we don't see any contradiction between those two books. So whether Krishnaji has written that book or not, it doesn't matter. But the content of that book are equally useful, is what I would say. Then let us talk about the influence of Buddha. Now, Theosophy considers Buddha as the highest evolved human being. That means if we consider the evolution of humanity as a fact, and if we consider that, yes, the humanity is evolving, and eventually all the human beings will get evolved into divinity, then according to that theory of evolution, Buddha is the highest evolved human being of our humanity. And because of theosophical teaching, whether that was the cause of Krishnamurti having high regards for Buddha, was it a theosophical influence or was it different? Now, if it were theosophical influence, then when Krishnaji parted with Theosophical Society and said that he had nothing to do with it, that influence also would have gone. Just as he coined new words to express what he wanted to convey, he would have done away with that influence also. But it doesn't look like that, because even afterwards, even during his discussions with other people, as late as in 1980s, he is referring to Buddha. And in that reference, he is having very high regards for Buddha. And in his biography, it is mentioned that Krishnaji always used to say that if there were a person who had directly heard Buddha, then Krishnamurti won't mind walking miles to meet such a person and ask him, what was it like listening to Buddha? And then later on, many of his conversations, he was talking about Buddha, the presence of Buddha, and so on. In fact, in some of the memoirs, you can read that, particularly the memoir of G. Narayan, where he has mentioned that Krishnaji once said that Buddha is here, ask questions. So there was quite a, I won't say influence, but Krishnaji had great regards for Buddha. Now, some people tried to take advantage of that and then started saying that, yes, Krishnaji is saying exactly the same thing what Buddha has said. And therefore, he is not saying anything different. Buddha had already said all those things 2,500 years ago. But then that statement was not acceptable to Krishnaji. Because historically speaking, the first written record of Buddha's teaching happened 400 years after passing away of Buddha. So there is no record available prior to that period. So how can it be considered as authentic? It is like saying that suppose if Krishnaji has spoken now and there is no recording, there is no record of what he has said except what the listeners have listened. And what listeners have listened, they remember it. And from their memory, they convey it to the next generation. Then the next generation also doesn't have any record. They also remember and they also convey it to the further generation. So like that, it keeps on happening for almost 400 years. And after 400 years, people of that generation, they start writing what they have heard as what Buddha has or what Krishnamurti has said. Now, what kind of record that would be? Would that be authentic? Or won't there be a lot of distortion, lot of changes, lot of mistakes, and so on? So it cannot be considered as authentic at all. So in the same way, whatever the record is available of Buddha's teaching, that is created 400 years after passing away of Buddha, and therefore cannot be considered as authentic. So Krishnaji never referred to that available record as Buddha's teaching. So whenever Buddhists came to discuss with him, right, what Krishnaji used to ask them, what do they understand as Buddha's teaching? So if Buddha has talked about meditation, then he will ask that Buddhist scholar, according to you, what did Buddha talk about meditation? What is Buddhist meditation? And then that person, whatever he has read from those Buddhist records, on that basis he will talk. And then Krishnaji would inquire into it, question it. And then if that scholar sees something which he had not seen before, then he will immediately jump and say, yes, that's exactly what Buddha said. So such kinds of dialogues, they happen. So in fact, they are quite interesting dialogues. They are available, the video recording is available on YouTube, Dialogue with the Buddhists. They are also published in the form of a book. The title of the book is Can Humanity Change? So therefore, actually you cannot compare the Buddhist teachings with Krishnaji's teaching, because there is no authentic record of Buddhist teaching. And therefore, you cannot really say that Buddha talked the same thing, what Krishnaji is talking today. Now, a person who makes such a statement, how does he know what Buddha has talked? He doesn't know, and yet he is making such a statement. So therefore, such statements are not authentic and should not be given much value. So whatever Krishnaji has discussed with Buddhist scholars, so from that it emerges that those Buddhist scholars themselves didn't understand properly what Buddha had preached. And by discussing with Krishnaji, probably with whatever clarity they were able to get out of those discussions, probably they were able to see things which they were not able to see before. Now, connection with Buddha, there is another aspect of it. I mean, now we are going into something which can be imaginary to you, or maybe imaginary to anybody who has no capacity to verify it. So we were saying that the past lives of Krishnaji were investigated by CWL, and they were published in the form of a book called Lives of Alkyone. So the book was published in 1924 in 2 volumes. And before those books, the narration of those lives, they were published in the Theosophist, and under the series title as Reigns in the Wheel of Time. Reigns in the Wheel of Time. Now, in those books, past 48 lives of Krishnaji were investigated, dating back to 70,000 BC. Now, among those 48 lives, only the last 2 lives are a little bit interesting. In fact, it is said that all those 46 lives were actually the preparation for the 47th and 48th life. And the present life of Krishnaji was 49th, if we continue that count. So it is said that in 47th life, Krishnaji was born at the same time as Buddha. And in that life, he was grief-stricken, deeply grieved because of the passing away of his son. And he was in great agony. And in that sorrowful state, he came to meet Buddha. And talking with Buddha, all his sorrow was over. And then he became a disciple of Buddha and continued to move with Buddha wherever he went till he died, till Krishnaji died. Krishnaji died before Buddha passed away in that life. And he became a Buddhist monk and continued to. So in that life, it is said that Krishnaji took a vow before Buddha, saying that as Buddha had worked for humanity and brought peace, brought eternal peace to them, so in the same way, Krishnaji would like to work to bring that eternal peace to humanity. And all his future lives, he vowed that he would dedicate for such work alone. So that time, Buddha said to him, yes, this vow taken before Buddha can never be broken, but it will become true in a distant future. So that was the major incident in that life. And during that life, he became friends with another Buddhist monk whose name was Dharmajyoti. And they became good friends. Dharmajyoti was a much more advanced disciple of Buddha, and he helped Krishnaji in understanding what Buddha was talking about. So that was the 47th life. And in 48th life, Krishnaji was born again in India during the time of Harshvardhan. That means Harshvardhan had just passed away, and then around that time he was born in the city of Kanauj. Now there he dedicated his life to the study of Buddhism, and he became a monk in one of the Buddhist monastery. And in that life also, the monk who was Dharmajyoti in the previous life, he was Arya Sangha in that life. And then there again, Krishnaji came in contact with Arya Sangha and then he worked with him and so on. And then Krishnaji passed away as the chief abbot of some Buddhist monastery. And now in this life, we find Krishnaji doing precisely the work which he vowed before Buddha. So this is just some reference. You may not accept it, you may just throw it as some nonsense. But the people who have written it, it was not nonsense for them. It was a fact for them. But we are not putting it as a fact, I mean, because we don't have any ways to verify this. So at the most, you can take it as as a theory and just put it aside as a theory. But the regards for Buddha, I mean, the point was that dates back to 2500 years ago with the actual meeting of Buddha, and then in his present teaching also, right? The Buddha seems to be, Krishnaji seems to be mentioning him. Because in one of the dialogues with Pandit Jagannath Upadhyay, now Pandit Jagannath Upadhyay was a Buddhist scholar. He was also a Vedantist. He had studied both Vedanta and Buddhism. And in that dialogue, Krishnaji is saying to Panditji, because Panditji had very high regards for Buddha. And Krishnaji says to him, Panditji, suppose Buddha is here and he tells you that just listen to what I am saying. And if you are able to listen, then that is your liberation. That means you have to do nothing else except listening to what the Buddha is saying. And if you are able to listen, then you are liberated. So will you listen? He is asking Panditji. So other participants in that dialogue, they thought that Krishnaji is pulling Panditji's leg by saying this. So they laughed. So Krishnaji said, no, this is not a laughing matter. I am really serious about this. I am seriously asking this question. Will you listen? And if you listen, why will you listen? And so on. So that is one incidence where Krishnaji has mentioned about Buddha. And the other one which you can hear or you can read is G. Narayan's memoir, where G. Narayan and Sunanda Patwardhan, they happen to be at Ohio. And one morning, Krishnaji just asked them to come to meet him. And when they entered Krishnaji's room, they found that the room was filled with a different kind of presence. And Krishnaji was looking very bright and different. And when they came and they sat, Krishnaji told them that Buddha is here, ask questions. And they were so much overwhelmed by that presence, they just didn't know what to ask. Then Krishnaji himself asked them a question. He said, what is the essence of the teachings? Means his teachings. Then G. Narayan said, you are the world. So Krishnaji accepted that, but then he added his own words by saying that observer is the observed. So both of them, they sat there for some time. Later on came out But G. Narayan writes that there was a completely different kind of presence in that room, and they were completely overwhelmed. And then they came out. So this is another incidence where the reference to Buddha comes as far as Krishnaji's life is concerned. There may be many more such examples, but I know these two definitely. So, Krishnaji's regards for Buddha cannot be taken advantage of to say that therefore the Buddhist teaching is same as Krishnaji's teaching. Because what is Buddhist teaching? There is no authentic record available. So whatever is available, that cannot be considered as the authentic teaching of Buddha. And therefore there is no point in comparing it with what Krishnaji has talked about. So I think now your questions are welcome. You can ask any question necessarily based on what we have talked just now, but whatever you have read.
Here, Kishorji, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please.
I feel that Kishorji, during the Buddha's time, probably there were no written records. Things must have been by verbally. It must have passed on.
Yes.
And possibly that, after 400 years, somebody decided to
write it
down.
Yeah.
And there is, of course, a possibility that when the knowledge passed on, there might be some corruption also.
Yes.
So verbatim, whatever Buddha has said, probably it's not that authentic.
Right.
But what I feel that since probably Krishnaji has gone through those like Buddhist teachings and various other teachings, he might have got the essence, might have learned something from that.
Yeah. No, but Krishnaji did not go through any of those things. That is what is the interesting part. Because when he was being groomed for his role as a world teacher, there were clear-cut instructions to the people who were grooming him, particularly CWL and Annie Besant. And they said that those instructions were from the Lord himself. When they say Lord, it was Lord Bodhisattva. He said that don't try to condition the mind of that boy along any particular philosophy or any particular teaching. Groom him physically, make him healthy, teach him the language so that he is able to speak properly whenever he wants to speak. But then leave his mind untouched. Don't try to do anything to his mind. His mind will be taken care of by the Lord himself. So therefore, Krishnaji was not taught even Theosophy. He was not taught any religious scripture. He was not taught any philosophy, nothing. So his mind was completely left alone for the Lord to take care. And so he had not read any Buddhist scriptures or all those things. But what he did was, if any Buddhist scholar comes to see him and he is discussing with that Buddhist scholar, right? So many times Krishnaji would ask him, okay, this is what we are discussing. Now, what Buddha has to say about this? So then that Buddhist scholar will try to explain based on whatever he has studied of Buddhism as to what Buddha might be saying on this particular issue. And then when he quotes that or when he says that, then based on that, then the Krishnaji would further inquire. Right? And like that, the dialogue used to go on. Right? And finally, it used to come to a point where the Buddhist scholar used to realize that what he has understood was wrong. And therefore, he has to then go with Krishnaji. So that is where either he has to leave what Buddha has said and go with Krishnaji to further inquire into that issue, or say that no, I will stick to Buddha only, and then his discussion with Krishnaji would come to an end. And it's not possible to further discuss further. So that is what used to happen.
Yeah, I mean, what I also got to know that Krishnaji has gone through some process and which is not known.
Yes.
So this insight that came to him, we don't know from where it came.
Yes.
And how the awakening happened in him.
Yeah.
So we really don't know.
Yeah, this process, we'll be talking about it. I don't know whether this is the right time to talk about it in details, because we do have enough time. We can talk about it, or if people have other questions, then maybe we take up those other questions first.
Sure,
and then put this process for our next session tomorrow in the morning.
Kishorji, I had asked you earlier about avatar, and second question, in one of the books he said that there was a Buddha's picture or painting or something like that, and he asked that what should I do? So Buddha replied that don't so open the flower completely, so just elaborate on that.
So let us talk about avatar. Let us talk about avatar. What is avatar? It is said, I mean, in the Hindu tradition and also Tibetan tradition and also in Theosophy, they talk about the reincarnation, and then the human beings getting evolved through the process of reincarnation. And then when their evolution is complete, that means when they have become perfect human beings, then they no longer need to take an incarnation or reincarnation. That means they don't have to be reborn again. They are free. So that is what the tradition considers as the freedom from the cycle of birth and death. So a person who is completely free from this cycle of birth and death, because the purpose of those reincarnations is fulfilled. That means he has perfected himself. So he doesn't need to take any further birth. Right? So such human beings, they are called as Jivan Muktas. That means they are free from the cycle of birth and death. So they need not be born again. So there is no natural compulsion for them to be reborn. But such human beings, when they do take birth for some work, for some function, for something to be done, which they alone can do and nobody else, then that birth is called as avtara. So avtara means a manifestation of such a being who is not naturally required to manifest in the physical body. So if such a person does manifest himself in the form of a physical body, then it is considered as avtara. So if you and me, if we die and we are reborn again, then our rebirth is not called as an avtara. It is just a rebirth because we haven't yet perfected ourselves. So we are compelled by the nature to take birth and keep on taking birth. And therefore, that is not called as an avtara. Avtara is when there is no compulsion from nature, and there is no compulsion from nature because there is nothing to be achieved by taking that birth. So therefore, you are not required to take birth as a natural course. But still, if you want to take birth to do some definite piece of work or to do some definite function, then that birth or that manifestation is called as avtara. Now in avtara also there are various ways in which the avatar can be taken. The first natural way is that such a being, he is born, directly born as a child with some parents, and then right from the birth, then he is looked after, groomed and all these things. So he can choose his parents to whom he can be born as a child. So he will only choose those parents who are likely to look after him the way he wants to be looked after, and so on. So that is, they say, is one of the ways. But in that way, that person will have to look after that body of the child with all its limitations and so on. So many times maybe the person doesn't want to do that work. So the next option is that being, he requests or asks one of his disciples to take birth with those parents. So that disciple is born and he takes care of the body of that child because he himself is a child. And when the body has grown to a certain level where it can take care of itself, then the disciple leaves that body and then it is occupied by that being. So that is another way the avatar can happen. But in Krishnaji's case, none of these options happened. Something totally different happened. What happened was that Krishnaji himself, by working on him, raised his consciousness to a level where he could meet the consciousness of the world teacher. So when his consciousness got blended with the consciousness of the world teacher didn't have to actually manifest as a physical body, because then Krishnaji became the channel for that intelligence of the world teacher. So this kind of thing had not happened
Kishore,
before. Yes.
In conversation with Mary Zimbalist and
Yes.
Pupul Chandra, he said that the boy must be special, and if I were you, I would start with the boy. So that means the boy really was special.
No, that we'll be talking about little later when we talk about process and all those things. Then we'll be talking about, and also we have to consider the question which was of great interest to Krishnaji, which he kept on mentioning again and again. Probably that was the only question which Krishnamurti was interested in his biography. That is, how could that boy remain unconditioned? How could nothing influence him? And how could the teaching manifest through that boy? What protected him? What kept him untouched by any of the praise, by any of the status that was showered on him, and so on? We'll be considering that question slightly later. But right now, we are only explaining what is an avatara as per what tradition thinks as avatara. Krishnaji has explained a little bit about this. You can hear it in those 2 videos which I have recommended. So, but the third possibility which has actually happened with Krishnaji was he raised his consciousness to the level where he could meet the consciousness of the world teacher, and therefore his consciousness got blended with the consciousness of the world teacher, and therefore he became a channel to the consciousness of the world teacher. So the world teacher didn't have to actually take a physical body in order to give his teaching, but through this channel he could just say, or he could just give his teaching. So some indirect hints about this we get from some of the statements of Krishnaji, particularly when Krishnaji says that he is just like a telephone. He is not the author of the teaching. He is not the originator of the teaching. He is just like a telephone, and he is just conveying whatever the teachings are. But then he doesn't talk about who is talking on the other side of the telephone. He doesn't talk about that, but he does say that he is like a telephone. So this is an indirect hint. Then he also talks about the otherness, and there is a lot of reference to otherness in his book titled as Krishnamurti's Notebook. He does talk about otherness, and this otherness, how powerful it is, that we'll consider when we do talk about Krishnaji's dialogue with death. And he talks about that. So there are such indirect references to such things which give some hint about what exactly may be happening, which we are not able to see.
So you mentioned about Buddha being highly evolved.
Yes.
Now, when you see in the light of Krishnaji's statement that
Yes.
he always maintained that psyche cannot evolve.
That's right.
It can only be ended,
Yes.
and that ending is not gradual.
Yes.
It is a perception which wipes away the content of
Yes.
consciousness. This is
Yeah.
what he said. Well, how do you
Yes.
explain this avatara, sir, in this background?
Yeah, I mean, Krishnaji himself has explained. I mean, if you particularly hear the third video where he is giving a public dialogue at Brockwood Park in 75, I have recommended that video to you to be seen. So in there, he is referring to Bodhisattva not as a person, but he's talking about that as the essence of compassion. So he's saying that there is such thing as essence of compassion, and that essence of compassion manifests in a human form to he doesn't use the word to teach, but it manifests to do away with the sorrow, or to lift the sorrow, to lift the humanity from that sorrow, or to end the sorrow of that humanity.
म्हणजे ज्ञानेश्वर म्हणालेत ना, विश्वाचे आर्त माझ्या मनी प्रकाशली, हेच म्हणायचं ना त्यांना.
No, I can't say that because I don't know what actually Jnaneshwar meant. Now here again we are entering into comparison. While I have said that it's better not to compare what we are talking about with what other saints have said, because we may be doing injustice to both the people. We are doing injustice to Krishnaji and we are also doing injustice to Jnaneshwar, because we really don't know what exactly he meant or all those things. But it may be so. Usually what we do is that whatever is our background, our makeup, so according to that we try to understand things. But here I would request you not to compare and then just go with what is being said. So he talks about the essence of compassion, and that essence of compassion manifests to relieve the humanity from sorrow, from whatever suffering it is going through. So he does talk about that. So avtara is just another word. I mean, we can discard that word if we are not comfortable with that. But then how do you take this statement that the essence of compassion manifests? So there is no mention of evolution here, or there is no such mention of I mean, evolution and all those things, those are the theosophical terminologies. So Krishnaji doesn't use that. So he just says that that essence of compassion manifests. So he doesn't talk about psychological evolution and all those things. But if you ask, how does that essence of compassion come about? Then that is, his whole teaching is about that only. He is telling us whether it is possible to come upon that compassion, that quality of love, whether it is possible to come upon that kind of intelligence. And that is, his whole teaching is about that. So I don't see any contradiction here.
No, of course not. Also, sir, how do you explain the title, The Years of Awakening? It suggests
Yes.
a kind of gradual awakening. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it appears like that. It does give that sense that the awakening was happening gradually.
Did Krishnamurti ever comment on Lead Beater's account of his past lives?
No, he only said that it is irrelevant. He said that it is not necessary to go through all that account in order to understand what he is talking about. So for him, what he was talking about was of utmost importance. And he wanted people only to focus on that and not on anything else. So anything else he termed as irrelevant. And so even this whole biography of his written by Mary Littens, he said that it was irrelevant. As he said, it is already past, it is already over, finished. So what is the point in going through it? And so in that last video recommended to you, there he is mentioning this. In fact, he puts a very interesting question. He's asking the people, what is the relationship of present K with the K of that time? And people do laugh at that question. So he's referring to the K of that time as a K which is already over. And the present K, with whatever he's talking about, is the only relevant K. And therefore, he said that he was not interested in discussing about that biography. And there is another interesting thing about Krishnaji was that around 1932, Krishnaji lost all the first-hand memory of his early life. That means that memory in some curious way was completely wiped out from his brain. And that wiping out was so final that he did not even remember his brother to whom he was greatly attached, the Nityanand. And so he had no first-hand memory of his life up to 1930, what happened. So whatever he knew was based on what other people told him about him, who had actually seen him during that period. They told him what he was like, what he talked about, how he behaved, conducted himself, and so on. So all the information which Krishnaji had about his early life was based on what others told him about it. It was not his first-hand recollection, because there was nothing to recollect in his brain. It was wiped out completely clean. And this is also in accordance with his teaching that whatever is unessential, why should the brain be burdened with that? And therefore it was simply wiped out. So naturally he doesn't remember firsthand anything of that period. So whatever he says is based on what others have told him. So therefore there are many times some errors in his whenever he refers to that period and quotes something about those events, then you can see some obvious errors, like say in that one of the videos he says that when he dissolved that organization in 1928, but actually he dissolved the organization in 1929, not 28, but he's mentioning there as 28. Obviously he doesn't remember correctly whatever he has been told by others. On that basis he is speaking. So whatever the theosophical things and whatever that is mentioned about him in the early period of his life up to 1930, now he has no first-hand recollection of that. And therefore you cannot ask him to verify any of that description based on his first-hand memory. So mostly he will talk on the basis of what others have told him. So naturally he can't verify whether whatever is written in the biography is factual or not factual. But then the author has written it based on the factual evidence there is a documentary evidence. There are people who have actually seen those things happening, who were witness to what was happening, and so on. So it's not a work of fiction. It's a work which is properly researched, properly investigated, the corresponding evidence gathered, and then it was written. So it's a biography, it's not a fiction which is describing Krishnaji's life.
Kishorji, can we say,
I'm sorry.
can I ask a
Please.
question, Kishorji?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Yeah. Kishorji, can we say that the period of 1983 is the actual period when he was formed? Because he denied through teachings that it's evolution, it happens, there's no time involved in transformation.
Yes.
What do you say about this?
That's right. I mean, I can quote another example of this. Krishnaji was discussing, somebody was discussing with Krishnaji about habit. So Krishnaji was explaining the nature of habit, how it gets formed, what happens, and so on, right? And then during the discussion, Krishnaji said to that person, give me 3 days time and I will show you that you can come out of any habit, you can break through any habit. So that person was a little bit taken aback. He asked Krishnaji, Krishnaji, you are always talking about instantaneous change. You are always talking about immediate transformation. And here you are asking 3 days to change. So doesn't it contradict what you are generally talking about? So Krishnaji said that no. In order to understand the nature of habit, I have to observe it, how it functions in my life, what it does. And with that kind of constant observation alone, the nature of habit can be understood. And in my case, probably I will need 3 days to observe the whole nature and the function of any habit. And only after that, the understanding, the complete understanding of habit is possible. So does that mean that he took 3 days to understand what habit is? The actual understanding, it happens instantaneously, it doesn't need time. But whatever that happens before that understanding, which is actually the work which one has to do by paying attention, by constantly observing, remaining with that reaction or that particular issue, right? That will take a real chronological time. Now, with us, the difficulty is that we don't do the work that is required to understand a psychological reaction. We keep on postponing it. And therefore, we are introducing an element of psychological time there. Because we say, what's the hurry? I will do it later. Or right now, I don't feel like observing it or going through it. So some other time I will do it, and so on. So that way we keep on postponing it. But if we say that, well, I'm interested in understanding this psychological reaction, so let me watch it. And therefore you start watching. So to start watching, you don't need time. You only need a decision. You only need to make up your mind that yes, you want to understand this psychological reaction. And in order to understand it, you have to watch it. And when you realize that you have to watch it, you immediately start watching. There is no further postponement. And so as you watch, the nature of that psychological reaction starts revealing to you. And that will take its own chronological time. And when the whole nature is revealed, you are already free of that reaction. So here, the time, the chronological time is definitely required. But then there is no psychological time in terms of postponement. And that is what I think he is referring to. And the actual understanding happens, the perception happens, when the whole nature of that habit is understood. Right? And the moment the whole nature is understood, right, at that moment itself the perception happens. So the actual perception is not taking any time. But the observation which is leading to that perception, that observation is taking its own chronological time. But there is no psychological time in the sense of postponement of the required action.
Yes, sir.
Is it true that Theosophists said that Lord Maitreya will speak through the world teacher?
Lord Maitreya will speak through the world teacher.
Yeah.
No, the question is not framed properly because Lord Maitreya himself is the world teacher, according to Theosophy. So the question is not framed properly. Probably he wants to ask the question whether the Lord Maitreya, who is the world teacher, whether he will speak through Krishnamurti. Probably that is what he wants to ask. Because whether world teacher, whether Lord Maitreya will speak through world teacher, it is like asking whether Naveen Kumar will talk through Naveen Kumar. The question amounts to that. I don't think that's the right question. Because Lord Maitreya and the world teacher is one and the same entity, according to Theosophy, only referred to by different names, different titles. Probably the question which he wants to ask is whether the world teacher will speak through Krishnamurti. So that is what the Theosophists believed. They said that yes, the world teacher was going to speak through Krishnamurti. And therefore, when Krishnamurti started his discourses, people asked him. In fact, if you read his earlier discourses, the kind of questions people asked him. So they asked him, "Sir, are you the world teacher who is speaking to us?" And then Krishnaji said that whether I am the world teacher or not the world teacher, that is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. But what I am saying is what matters, and that is important because only listening to that can change your life. But the knowledge, whether the world teacher is speaking or not, that knowledge is not going to change your life. And therefore it is irrelevant. So that is how he used to reply to that.
Sir, Krishnaji had lived in Sequoia National Park, California in 1944 for about 6 months, and he was all by himself in a log cabin.
Yes, yes.
There was no account anywhere. I could not find. I was just curious if there is any account how he lived in those 6 months.
Yeah, there are a few accounts of that you can find. In fact, during that period, he had a dialogue with a tree there in that park. And it's a very interesting dialogue that he had because he wrote an article about that dialogue, which was published in one of the journals. He's that Herald of the Star under the editorial notes. So he said that that Sequoia National Park has the oldest living trees of of the world.
400, 500 years, sir.
And yeah, so no, more than that. The oldest one, he said something like 4,000 to 5,000 years old, that old. And those trees are also huge, gigantic trees those are. So Krishnaji says that the oldest tree in that park, the spirit of that tree talked to him, talked to Krishnaji. And what it said, he has mentioned in that dialogue with the tree. So that is one such record. The another was, he mentioned about an incident where he saw some grizzly bear. Grizzly bear are very big big entities. And the one he saw was a mother bear having the little ones. And Krishna mentioned it in one of his writings. And then when he mentioned that incident to the caretaker of that park, then that fellow got quite angry with Krishnaji, saying that, you know, what kind of risk you had taken, because that bear could have easily attacked you, particularly a mother bear having young kids. It's very dangerous to encounter because she can easily attack.
He says they looked at each other and they were at the distance of 10 feet. And finally he folded his hands and he said, "You win, lady," and walked away. But I just wanted to know how he might have lived, you know, the 6 months, like that he was all alone, like his food and things like that. But there's no account of that.
No, I don't have. At least I don't know of such account. Yeah.
Kishorji?
Yes.
Shinde?
Yeah. Please, Chandrakantji, ask. Yes.
Say something more about spiritual hierarchy.
Spiritual hierarchy. Yeah.
You have said Buddha, the highest evolved person in whole of humanity.
Yeah.
Any other persons is then?
Yes, I mean the spiritual hierarchy is explained in the Theosophy and also Hindu and Tibetan tradition. So according to them, there are say 5 initiations initially. And those 5 initiations, the 5th one, after the 5th initiation, the person becomes Jivan Mukta. And after he becomes Jivan Mukta, the evolution doesn't stop there, but then evolution continues further. But then it is no longer called as the human evolution. It is called as the divine evolution.
Divine.
That means the divinity keeps on further unfolding. So after Jivan Mukta, there is one more initiation. And after that initiation, the next one is the initiation of the world teacher. Now, what is the difference between such human beings? So, according to Theosophists, or according to, say, those who could directly observe all these things, the interesting thing is that both CWL and Annie Besant, they say that through their direct observation, they are writing this. And they are not quoting it from any scriptures or any granthas or books. And therefore, it is authentic. And they say that it is possible for anybody to observe like that, provided he develops those capabilities in him. And to develop those capabilities, what kind of life he has to lead and all those things, all that they have mentioned and so on. So they are not talking out of imagination, but they say that, yes, this is actually observable. So if you ask them, what is the difference between a Jivan Mukta and an ordinary person like me? In what way the Jivan Mukta is different from me, who is an ordinary common man? So to give some idea of that difference. They use a simile. They say that suppose as a common man, you have a pet dog. You have a dog as a pet. And you look after that dog and you live with that dog. And then they ask you, what is the difference between you and the dog? And so if you can imagine in what way you are different from the dog, right? And to whatever scale you measure that difference. Now the same scale if you are going to use to measure the difference between you and the Jivan Mukta, then the difference will be 10 times that scale. Which means that whatever is the difference between you and your pet, 10 times or more is the difference between you and the Jivan Mukta. And then they say that, then what is the difference between Jivan Mukta and the world teacher, that is Bodhisattva? Then they say that these Jivan Muktas, they consider themselves as the dust of the feet of Bodhisattva. So from this comparison, they say that you can imagine what is the stature of Bodhisattva. And about Buddha, they say Buddha is far beyond all this, simply not accessible. He has already passed beyond all this. And then they also talk about beings who are even higher than Buddha. So this whole hierarchy is there. And the highest position in the hierarchy which exists on the earth, according to Theosophists, is the position of the king. And in biography, there is a mention of that king. He's called as the king of the world. So in Hindu tradition, he is referred to as Sanat Kumara. Sanat Kumara is the lord of the world as far as the earth is concerned. In fact, they say that the whole of the earth exists in the consciousness of the Lord of the world. That means whatever is happening on earth is happening within his consciousness. So which means that nothing can be hidden from him. Everything is happening within him only. So this is the kind of hierarchy they talk about. But in hierarchy, the word hierarchy is not that correct because it gives a sense of superior and inferior. While there is no such sense, it is like a fully grown tree doesn't consider itself as superior compared to a small plant. A small plant has its own place, it has its own beauty. A big tree has its own stature, its own beauty. But then a big tree doesn't consider itself as superior to that small plant, or the small plant doesn't consider itself as inferior to that big tree. There is no such sense there. So in this hierarchy, although the way it is put, it creates some sense of superiority and inferiority. And the human brain, which is always in the state of measurement, always wants to identify itself with the highest. And so therefore, he may end up in comparing all these mighty beings and then finally identifying his little mind with the highest, which he imagines. But then that identification, he doesn't become that high, but that image of that high becomes small like him. So which goes with the statement which Krishnaji has said, that a petty mind can think of God, but the God of that petty mind is also petty.
Mhm.
So that is what usually happens. So therefore,
Mhm.
Krishnaji always discards this kind of
Mhm.
comparison and this kind of hierarchy,
Mhm.
because it creates that sense of superiority and inferiority, which is totally false, because there is no such thing
Mhm.
as superior and inferior there.
Yes. Mhm. Yeah.
And that world teacher Krishnaji calls as the essence of compassion.
Mhm.
So it is nothing but compassion,
Mhm.
and that compassion manifests.
How was he prepared to become a world teacher?
Yes, maybe I think, well, I'll briefly go through it, whatever the record is available according to that. As we have said that he was to be groomed physically. That means his body has to be made healthy. He has to be taught whatever the knowledge required in conducting himself in his day-to-day life. And particularly, he was to be taught the English. That means he should know English very well, because that was the language which would be used by the world teacher to communicate to humanity. And so particular emphasis was given on teaching him English properly. And so the grooming started. Now, world teacher is such a august or mighty being, and he had to be subjected to the limitations of a physical human body. So that body should be as perfect as possible. So the people who were grooming Krishnaji, their viewpoint was quite different than the viewpoint of a ordinary home-loving person or ordinary family person. Suppose if Krishnaji's teeth, they were not straight, so they had to use some clip to straighten his teeth. Right? Now that did cause some pain, some discomfort to Krishnaji. Now some people will look at it as completely unnecessary and torturous. But the people who were thinking of world teacher, they will say, how can the world teacher have crooked teeth? The world teacher must have good teeth. He can't have crooked teeth. Similarly, his legs, they were also modified a little bit by asking him to wear certain kind of shoes. And then his whole physical body was groomed in such a way that it would become a very, very handsome physical body, because the world teacher can't be ugly looking. There has to be beauty about everything that is connected with the world teacher. So this was at the physical level. But then at the psychological level, Krishnaji should not end up in doing something which can become an hindrance to the expression and manifestation of the world teacher. Because if the consciousness of the world teacher is going to function through that body, then that body should not have tendencies and habits which can become a hindrance to that manifestation. So if there are some preferences and likes and dislikes in that body, then they could become hindrance to that manifestation. So all those likes and dislikes have to be removed. So the body should eat only the food which is right kind of food for that body, which is healthy food. And food should not be eaten as per the likes and tastes of the person called Krishnamurti. And therefore, in that training, they had to break all his eating habits. So it is mentioned in the biography that if he says that he liked some particular food item, then the moment he mentions that, then for next several days, he will be served only that food item, till the time he says that he no more likes it. So that eating habit was broken like that, and in many different ways. Like say, for example, there should not be any kind of fear in him. So if any trace of any kind of fear is seen in him, immediately the work is to begin on that. And it would be seen that he is free from that fear. So one example is mentioned in his biography about this fear thing, that Krishnaji used to go to Adar river to swim. And that time even CWL and many other children also, they used to swim. And CWL was keeping a close watch on all the activities of Krishnaji. And so he noticed that while swimming, Krishnaji avoided a particular hole in that river. He was afraid to go there. So the moment this was noticed, then the work on that began. So even after finishing the swimming and all this and coming out, then in the evening again CWL said to Krishnaji, now let us go to swimming again. And then once they were in the river, then he said, okay, now let's go to that hole and see what it is. And so he took him there and all this thing. And so when Krishnaji actually went there and he found that there was nothing to be afraid of there, and so all the fear was gone. Right. So like that, a very rigorous work was done on those boys. So that was the preparation that was being done on the Krishnamurti. But then the real preparation happened in terms of the process. Now, process we are going to talk about later on. So I'm not going to talk about it right now. So that process was the real preparation. And what was the nature of that process, what Krishnaji had to say about it, and what actually it was, and so on. So probably we may discuss it tomorrow in our first session. But there was a rigorous work that was being done on Krishnamurti. Because to keep the body healthy, the regular exercise, the regular playing, so he used to play tennis. Then it was compulsory that every day he should cycle for at least 30 kilometers, cycling every day, swimming. So in fact, the way he was groomed, and if you look at some of his photographs of that time, you will see that he was one of the most handsome persons you would have ever seen. He was looking very handsome, very radiant, very energetic, and very handsome. That is how he was groomed. Not only that, but then there was a question of magnetism, in the sense that the negative thoughts of the persons can affect the things around. So if you have a negative thought in you, then that negative thought can affect the other persons in your vicinity, or it can also affect the objects around you. So in what way they can affect the objects? So they say that those objects around such a person, they get magnetized by those negative thoughts. And when somebody else comes in contact with those objects, then he gets affected by those negative thoughts, which have got impressed on those objects. So if Krishnaji is using a racket to play the tennis, that means he is holding that racket and using it to play tennis. Then if somebody else holds that racket, and if that somebody else has negative thoughts in him, then those negative thoughts will get impressed on that racket. And then when Krishnaji will hold that racket, he will be influenced by those negative thoughts. And therefore, nobody was allowed to touch his racket. So nobody was also allowed to use his bicycle. So whatever things which he was specifically using, nobody else was allowed to touch it, except maybe those people about whom they are sure that he doesn't have any negative thoughts. So only such persons will be allowed to touch, but nobody else. So there are even more things into it. So we will go into it as we talk about the process tomorrow. There are many more further details about this. But it was not an ordinary task. If we are subjected to that kind of regimentation, probably we will give up and we'll say that, no, I'm not interested in any of these things. It was quite a rigorous kind of regimentation.
Kishorji, can I ask a question?
Yeah. Yes,
Neha here, sir. So this workshop is, I mean, it's already very fascinating, and I think the next sessions are going to be even more interesting. But sir, the thing is with these esoteric aspects, which we have no way of observing for ourselves. I mean, it's very interesting, and the mind has this tendency to latch on to them and make theories and, get carried away. So in what would be the right way to listen to all this in a way that it would help to deepen our journey into the teachings rather than...
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So we talked a little bit about it in the morning. We said that yes, there is a way which is acceptable to even science. That means considering these facts as a theory and then experimenting with that theory. So that kind of thing is there in science also. So based on the observations in various experiments and the conclusions drawn from that, and with all those conclusions put together, they have some kind of understanding of certain things. And that understanding is considered as a theory related to that phenomenon. So we have theory of relativity, we have theory of quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and so on. We have theory of the origin of the universe and so on. And so these are all theories. They are called theories because they haven't been completely verified as yet. But then why are they held on to? They are held on to because they help in understanding certain experiments, certain phenomena, and certain, you can say, the structure of the universe. They help in that. And that help is not only in terms of the understanding of the structure, but these theories also help in predicting the result of an experiment if it is carried out. So one has a certain theory. Based on that theory, you design some experiment, and then you say, according to this theory, what would be the observation in this experiment? what could be the conclusion, what could be the result of this experiment. So you predict that result based on that theory. Then you actually carry out the experiment and observe. And if you see the same result as predicted by the theory, then that theory is a good theory because it confirms with the experimental observation. So they continue with that. And if it doesn't confirm, then they try to modify that theory in order to accommodate the new findings and new observations. And if the theory is modifiable, then it still continues as acceptable. But if some observation is found which completely contradicts that theory, then that theory is discarded. Then say, though, it's not a good theory. Then they, based on that fresh observation or new evidence, they again try to formulate another theory. So that kind of thing goes on in science. And it is one of the accepted ways of understanding things based on knowledge. So we are talking about knowledge-based understanding. So now all this that we are talking about is also a kind of knowledge, but still unverifiable because we don't have the resources to verify this. So therefore, we can only take them as theories. So if we take them as theories, then what kind of results that theory predicts in various situations in our life, and whether those results are observable. And if they are observable, then we can say that, yes, probably then this theory has some stuff in it. It has some reality about it. And therefore, you go with that. So that is one of the ways. But then, as you are inquiring into the teachings of Krishnaji, and you are doing all the required work, that is observing yourself as you go through your day-to-day existence, paying attention to what's happening to you, your reactions, and so on. And out of all that, the understanding of yourself, and therefore the enhancing of the sensitivity. So as that sensitivity starts unfolding in you, then that sensitivity itself will enable you to verify some of these things. And if you are able to verify even the slightest thing, then that can work in furthering your interest in that, and then you will be more interested in verifying further. So then you may start working upon yourself even more vigorously and more intently. So in that sense, it can help.
Yes, sir. So when I'm listening to all this, it does seem like this provides a bigger context within which Krishnaji's teachings seem much more relevant than if without having a broader context in this terms of, as you said, the evolution and hierarchy and all of that. So it makes it a lot more important.
Krishnaji also mentions indirectly about these things. For example, when you say about reincarnation, right? So Krishnaji says that if you really believed in reincarnation, then you will change right now. Because if you don't change now, you will be exactly same in your next incarnation also. So just by reincarnating, you are not going to change. You are going to be the same human being because you are going to carry the same psychological content, same psychological stuff with you. And therefore, you will be exactly same in your next life also if you don't change now. So he says that means you really don't believe in reincarnation. But if you really believed, you would have changed yourself. You wouldn't have postponed things. You would have immediately begun work on yourself. So in that way also, he indirectly points out at these things. Then there is also in tradition, they talk about law of karma. Now, Krishnaji looks at it in a different way. Maybe we'll in some other time we'll go into that. How Krishnaji looks at this so-called karma, and maybe what is the right understanding of that. So we'll go into that because we have many more sessions now. So probably now is the time to end this session. So tomorrow morning, maybe we will go into the the process which Krishnaji went through, because that is also part of the grooming that was being done to prepare Krishnaji for the manifestation of the world teacher. So maybe we'll talk about process tomorrow, and then further questions that may arise in your mind. So once again, I would like to say that we are not talking about fiction. We are talking about the authentic record of whatever that has happened, whatever that has been done. And this authentic record is produced by those people who were in a position to actually verify, actually observe and verify all these happenings. So does that mean that we have to simply accept the authority of those people? No, we are not saying we have to accept the authority, because that won't change the situation much. But we have to differentiate between authority and authenticity. Now, authority means you accept something without examining it on the basis of who has told it to you. So for example, if Krishnaji tells you something and you simply accept it without even bothering to verify it, then you are accepting Krishnamurti as an authority. So that is the nature of authority. While authenticity is different. In authenticity, what we say that what Krishnaji is talking about, is it authentic? Now, authenticity is based on various other factors. For example, somebody who has not studied mathematics at all, and he talks about mathematics, then whatever he talks, there is not much authenticity about it. While somebody who has spent a large part of his life in studying mathematics, and when he talks about mathematics, then we consider his talk as authentic, because he has spent time in studying that subject. So in the same way, a person who has not read or studied Krishnamurti at all, and he talks about what Krishnamurti's teaching is, then we don't consider his speech as authentic. Because we say that he has not studied anything, he doesn't know what Krishnaji is talking about. And yet he is telling us what Krishnaji is saying. And therefore, it is not considered as authentic. So you may not like to even spend your time in listening to such a person. But somebody, say, who has spent quite a lot of time in studying and trying to understand what Krishnamurti is talking about, then whatever he says has some authenticity about it. Right? We are not saying that he is completely right, or whatever he says is the only kind of understanding of the teaching. But what we are saying is that there is a likelihood that some of the things which he is talking about, they are likely to make some sense to us, because the person has spent time in studying and in trying to understand what Krishnaji says. And therefore, you consider that person as authentic. But you are not taking that person as an authority, because you are not going to accept anything without properly examining it and properly verifying it, right? But nevertheless, you are willing to give your time to listen to that person because he sounds authentic. Otherwise, there are n number of people, and if you start giving your time to each one of them just to listen to them and find out what they are talking about, then you have very limited time. And most of your time is spent in just listening to such persons, and then finally coming to a point where you see that, yes, that person is talking nonsense. And you have simply wasted your time in listening to that person, right? And therefore, you don't want to end up in such kind of situation where a person has trotted from ashram to ashram, listening to different gurus, and finally realizing that he got nothing. So, which means that he hasn't tried to find out the authenticity of a person. So that is why we said that there are scriptures, there are so many granthas and all these things. But what is the authenticity of those granthas, of those scriptures? Are they really authentic, or there is a likelihood of lot of things which might have got mixed up with them? And therefore, you have to really sort them out, try to find out what could be authentic, what may not be authentic, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. So which is quite a lot of exercise. And if you want to spend your time and energy in that, well, you are free to do so. But then when you have authentic material before you, why do you want to spend your time on such material whose authenticity is questionable? And therefore, I think the wise choice would be to go with such material whose authenticity is established. And then you consider that, then you are likely to get something out of it. More likely to get something out of it. But not from the material whose authenticity is not established, whose authenticity is doubtful. So I think in that sense, one has to approach all these things. Now, we are considering Theosophy as authentic because the people who have written about these things, they claim that by direct observation, they have written about it. They are not quoting from some granthas and all these things. And if at all they are quoting just to show that even in those granthas, they had talked about these things which they have found. And of course, there is some empirical evidence also to corroborate the findings of these people. I'm talking particularly about CWL. I mentioned in the morning, and mentioning it now also, that some of the findings are verifiable on the basis of science. So you can say that he's not talking something imaginary or some fiction, but what he's talking about is quite factual. So I think the importance is to have correct attitude towards these things, not to accept it blindly, not to reject it wholly, but to take a stand where we say that we really don't know, we are not in a position to verify it. And therefore, we can say that, well, I don't completely understand it as yet, but it can serve as a good working theory to understand certain things in my day-to-day life. So which can go hand in hand with the understanding obtained through direct observation. So there need not be any contradiction between these two. So I think we have finished today's session. We'll continue
tomorrow morning
at 10:30.
Thank you, sir.
So I'm ending the meeting. So thank you, everybody. And
Thank you, sir.
tomorrow. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.